Tonight, an ABC News special, the year 1968, with correspondent Diane Sawyer.
1968. Does it seem an eternity ago, or does it seem yesterday?
It was a hell of a year.
And correspondent Connie Chung.
Did you know in your heart that your husband had died?
I had a sense that this was it. When I think of the train ride after his death...
Of course, it would have been better if he had lived.
Could you hear the
Was
demonstrator?
watching the protests and the people fighting in the streets as my father's giving.
Did you plaster Hubert Humphrey's headquarters with graffiti, murderer?
Yes.
There was tragedy all over the place.
We believed we could change the world back then. We really believed we could end the war.
On some level, wouldn't you like to leave it behind you?
We're not all bad guys. We just did what our country asked us to do.
Did you feel responsible for your crew members?
Yes, that's my job. I was their skipper.
1968. What we did, what we saw, when the whole world was watching.
Good evening. Something that no one alive has ever seen is coming. The end of a millennium, the year 2000. A chapter closes and we move on. But somewhere out there in time and space, we leave behind a year in which Americans felt the planet was spinning so wildly, the center wouldn't hold. The year was 1968. Tonight, we're going to look at some of the ways time past lives on in time present.
We're not just looking back at the extraordinary men and women who made history in that convulsive time. The people we tracked down have experienced a personal evolution in 30 years. Now they are fueling vehicles of change, from taking on the tobacco industry to fighting for gay rights. They are all graduates of that crash course of activism taught in 1968. Get ready. We're going back for war, rioting, and rebellion, when the whole world was watching. Right from the start, every week, every month in 1968 seemed to bring Americans a fresh wound. And so many of them led back to Southeast Asia.
There's something happening here. What it is ain't exactly clear. There's a man with a gun over there, telling me I got to beware. I think it's time we stop. Children, watch that sound. Everybody look what's going down.
By 1968, 2 million tons of bombs had been dropped on Vietnam.
What a field day for the heat.
We're winning, President Johnson said, or we're about to. Polls showed most Americans believed him and were in favor of the war.
For our side. It's time we stop. Hey, what's that sound? Everybody look what's going down.
On the ground, Johnson kept committing troops until the number passed 500,000. 1968 would turn out to be the deadliest year of the war. More than 14,000 American soldiers killed in action. Almost 100,000 wounded, many of them in ways that would never fully heal.
Everybody look what's going down. Stop now. What's that sound? Everybody look what's going down.
On January 31st, the Vietnamese celebrated their most important holiday, Tet. U.S. troops were partying too, so defenses were down. A young diplomat, Alan Wendt, was on duty at the American embassy that night.
I was asleep when I heard a very loud explosion. And at first, I thought, well, it's Tet. I didn't realize exactly what was going on.
But it wasn't fireworks. The embassy was under attack. For the first time ever, the Viet Cong had stormed through the outer wall of the embassy compound. Alan Wendt was one of the 9 Americans trapped in the building. He managed to phone an official at the State Department in Washington.
And he said, "What the hell is going on out there?" And I said, "Phil, listen." And just as I held up the phone, you could hear another rocket thudding into the building.
After 6.5 hours, the Marines finally regained control.
When I walked out of the embassy and saw the compound littered with mangled dead bodies, I just couldn't believe it. And this was the American embassy, the seat of American power.
That day, the Viet Cong launched the Tet Offensive, attacks on nearly every city and town in South Vietnam. In 2 fearful months, more than 80,000 soldiers and civilians were killed. Ann Cunningham was a nurse at a MASH unit in Vietnam. Early in 1968, she was seeing the war change.
We tried to keep the operating room going 24 hours a day, and sometimes that was difficult, but that's what we were doing just because the casualties kept coming in.
The Tet Offensive helped turn opinion against the war. Watching at home on TV every single night, people were horrified by the pictures of American kids wounded and burned in battle.
I had always grown up with the country was right. You know, we were the good guys wearing the white hats, and whatever we did, we were always right. And then you start to question, is this going to go on forever until the last American is dead?
On the first day of the Tet Offensive, one of the 500,000 Americans in Vietnam was a 23-year-old Army squad leader named Tom Corey.
We got a call that morning to saddle up. We were going out on a mission. But on this particular day, on January 31st, I had a very uncomfortable feeling that I didn't want to go.
Despite his edgy combat instincts, this was a normal mission, no different than dozens of others.
The rest of the guys jumped and moved into the perimeter of the village, and I told my guys to stay down, and we called in for artillery strikes. I felt it was time for me to take a look and see what was going on. As I turned to the left, I saw a flash, a muzzle flash. That was the last thing I remember.
The bullet struck him in the neck, cutting his jugular and his spine. A helicopter flew him to a field hospital where doctors expected he would die. Instead, Tom Corey lived, but his life changed dramatically. He's almost completely paralyzed from the neck down.
Hi, Elaine, how are you?
His vocal cords are damaged.
Good, thank you.
It's hard to talk above a whisper.
I'll be there in case somebody calls in.
Years of therapy restored some use of his arms, but his hands are twisted in permanent contortion. He is always in pain. No moment of Corey's life is simple. None ever will be.
I was a person that was very independent and didn't have to ask somebody else to do something for me. My family kept telling me it's all right, and I kept saying it's not all right. I don't want to live like this. It's not me, and it's not going to be me.
The worst fear was that he would live out his life as a burden on his 9 brothers and sisters, his mother and father. Torn by his agony, Corey begged his doctors to tell his family he was dead. The doctors refused. What happened when you saw your parents?
I got real emotional. And I could see the hurt. I could see the hurt and pain in their eyes. And I know what they have done for me, for my 9 brothers and sisters. And it affected my dad pretty bad. He didn't believe in the war, and he didn't believe the way our government was running it. And it was just hard for him to swallow, to look at me like this.
But today, he wants people to look at him, to see that his life is about possibilities, not limitations. He's worked for years to help other disabled people achieve what he has: a full, active life. Long before most of us had heard of disability rights, he was fighting for things that make life easier for the disabled. Control devices for vans, ramps for wheelchairs. Tom Corey has helped bring change.
Pedro, my friend. How you doing?
This is his favorite battleground, a veterans hospital, and those who suffered terrible wounds fighting for others. Fight for yourselves, he tells them, for better hospitals and improved medical care.
Hang in there.
The man who once worried that he'd live as a burden has become an inspiration. To many, a hero.
How you doing?
Hey, how you doing?
Good.
My name's Chuck. Yours?
Tom Corey.
Yeah, I heard about you.
Uh-oh.
No, good things. I can operate my chair. Yeah, and they got me feeding myself and brushing my teeth, so I see the other quad, you know, and the guys, and some of them been injured like yourself 30, 40 years, you know, and they got a lot to show me, so I gain a lot being here, you know.
Mm-hmm. How you doing, dude? How you doing?
And maybe the most important thing he does is the simplest. He listens to the many, many other veterans like himself.
My unit, the 173rd, and survivor of the 68 Tet Offensive. I'll be very proud to wear this anytime, any place.
It was a crazy war. There was a lot of things that happened during that time. There was
At schools, Tom Corey finds young people who don't know about the war.
And the war was a matter of survival for us and for the enemy.
Textbooks cover it in a page or so. He is a history lesson the students can talk to.
Uncomfortable because his best friend died in the war, and when he tried to sleep at night, he'd just wake up like sweating.
They need to talk about it. It's what they did was right. They didn't do anything wrong, and discuss it.
Many veterans prefer to ignore the war, but that's not an option for Tom Corey. His wheelchair reminds him of it every day. Have you made peace with what the Vietnam War did to you?
I've never had any anger towards the guy that shot me. He got the round off before I did. If he wouldn't have, I would have got him. He was trying to survive and go home. I was trying to survive and go home. And one of us got shot.
1, 2, 3.
Even though he's the one who got shot, Tom Corey did make it home. So you might be surprised to see where he's traveling now. Back to Vietnam. 5 years ago, Tom Corey was a founder of the Veterans Initiative. Their mission is to find Americans missing in action and help our former enemies, the Vietnamese, find their missing as well. A friend took this video of Corey's delegation to Hanoi in June.
I would like to present these documents to you.
Corey gave officials sketches of battle sites drawn from memory and dozens of war souvenirs taken by GIs that might help locate the missing. In return, the Vietnamese have given the Veterans Initiative the remains of more than a dozen American MIAs. These are Vietnam stories that he has helped bring to a close. But Tom Corey's own Vietnam story goes on, and so does his mission, to remind us all of what he saw back in 1968.
I made a commitment to a bunch of friends of mine that didn't make it home from Vietnam. I wouldn't allow them or their sacrifices to be forgotten. I do it for them to educate other people about what happened and that we're not all bad guys. We just did what our country asked us to do.
This ABC News special, The Whole World Was Watching, continues after this from our ABC stations.
On 2020 Friday, the Army called the crash pilot error. These women think it was something else and are determined to clear their husbands' names. On 2020 Friday. Then Sunday, the chance to own a home of your own, no matter how little money you have. Thousands believed it, but was it just an elaborate scam? On 2020 Sunday.
On the highway of life, it's nice to meet an honest man.
Talk to me.
Voice Stream Wireless gives you more. With 10 cents a minute weekdays.
Now that's good.
More for your money. Guaranteed.
Great.
And weekends?
Do you like parties?
Now 0 cents a minute.
We'll have a great time. I guarantee it.
So get Voice Stream and get more from life. Guaranteed.
Hello.
The
fragrance for treasured moments. Trésor. Lancôme, Paris. Everything she wants is at Lancôme. Trésor Harmony, $47, and Trésor Romantique, $60. Now at Meyer and Frank.
There is a difference in breaking weather coverage. See why the Channel 2 Storm Team gives you a powerful edge. First, with hardcore information. Fast, with key school closures. Focused, with conditions pinpointed to your neighborhood. Channel 2 News. Stay safe. Stay informed. See why the Channel 2 Storm Team is your best choice for breaking weather coverage. Now and into the next millennium. Experience the power of 2000.
A shopper goes berserk on a clerk.
The story at 11.
It's hard to remember now, but at the beginning of 1968, so many Americans passionately believed that if the United States pulled out of Vietnam, all of Southeast Asia would fall to communism. And the foremost believer was the man in the White House, Lyndon Johnson. This past year, the Clintons have seen what it's like to be surrounded by turmoil in the White House. But back in 1968, the pressure was even more intense, and American lives were at stake.
Then, as now, a president in crisis found that the one person who never wavered was his wife. She could listen. She could be trusted. This month, Lady Bird Johnson is 86 years old.
Hi, y'all.
Her eyesight is failing, but her graciousness never does.
Far away, or where are you from?
Utah.
Oh, yes.
The Johnson Ranch is now a national park. After all, she was an environmentalist before the term even existed. 25 years after his death, Lyndon Johnson still looms large, the master politician in all his vitality, with its strengths and flaws.
You told me something once about your marriage. It's sort of inscribed in my heart about marriages. Because as we know, he was a complicated man.
Mm-hmm.
And you said to me once, he hurt me and he made me believe I could do things I didn't know I could do. And that's what love is.
Well, in our case, we were better together than we were apart. And I knew that, and I loved my share of my life with him.
1968. Does it seem an eternity ago, or does it seem yesterday?
Now it has retreated. When it was going on, it felt like it was forever, and it was a hell of a year. Every now and then there was a little moment of euphoria and an open window, and you thought, here it is. I'm going to find my way out of this maze. And then it would close up again.
From inside the White House, day after day, the president could hear demonstrators chanting anti-war slogans. Hey, hey, LBJ, how many kids did you kill today? The Pentagon kept pressing Johnson for more young men to send to Vietnam, but more was never enough. The protesters were calling Johnson a heartless monster. But in fact, Vietnam was devouring him too. He'd suffered a heart attack a dozen years earlier, given up smoking, switched to a better diet. By 1968, he knew he was at the edge of exhaustion. Privately, he started telling Lady Bird he might bow out of the re-election race at any time.
He was worried about the possibility of a stroke.
Mm-hmm. Well, of anything debilitating.
The State of the Union. Here the country is in the middle of this convulsion. And he walks into this eruption of applause. Do you remember that night?
Oh, Lord, I'll never forget it, because I didn't know how that speech was going to end.
Because?
He had very strongly considered making his announcement that he was not going to run for re-election.
Did you say, do it, don't do it?
No, because I wouldn't have consequences that he would. Only he could deal with the consequences.
So when he walks in...
I didn't know how it was going to end.
You really didn't know what he was going to do?
I had seen it written out on the back of an envelope that he was going to fish out of his pocket.
When he didn't do it, what did he say to you afterwards?
Well, I was partly relieved and partly sorry. So it was just a time of great stress in all directions.
2 weeks after the speech, the enemy in Vietnam launched that bloody Tet Offensive. The shock of America's vulnerability shattered Americans' faith in Lyndon Johnson. After Tet, barely a quarter of the nation supported the war. At the center of the storm, Lady Bird kept a recorded diary. She agreed to reread passages for us.
The stars are coming back on Lyndon's eyes. First one and then the other. Red and swollen and painful. I thought Riley that his life sounded more and more like the tribulations of Job. Nonetheless, he is remaining calm, even-tempered, serenely philosophic about politics. But about the war itself, he is deeply worried.
On the one side, there are people calling your husband a warmonger, shouting the slogans we heard them shout. On the other side, there are people saying the U.S. must never lose a war, the U.S. must not cut and run. Are there moments at which you think you're actually going to break?
Yes, but also you know you are not. Because you know you won't be able to give him every tenderness and balm and care that you can.
I cannot imagine what it was like to look at the fatality figures when they came in.
Oh, God. That was the bad thing. That was the bad thing.
Did it torment him?
Oh, of course it did. And particularly thinking of two son-in-laws over there and seeing how it also tormented those two girls, our children.
The war was so unpopular, the president did most of his traveling to military bases, where he could rally the troops and his own spirits.
It is never easy to ask men to leave home and happiness for duty far, far away.
For 30 years, he had been the country's shrewdest politician, the civil rights president, the war on poverty president. But now he talked with Lady Bird again about the trap his presidency had become. And she talked to her diary.
There was much that cried out in me to go on, to give and work, to spend and fight right up to the last. And if he lost, well and good. We were free. I think what was going on over and over in Lyndon's mind was what I had heard him say increasingly these last months. I do not believe that I can unite this country.
Unprecedented.
On the last day of March, he scheduled a television speech on the war and spent an entire afternoon rehearsing.
Almost 30% in the past 7 years. A gain as large as that. Gosh, this is hard to read, Jim.
But he did not practice the end of the speech. A handful of people knew why and wondered if this time he would do it.
How did he write what he was going to say that night?
Well, he just said it real clear and plain out, and then some of the best people who were with us wrestled with it.
There's one report that you helped write it, that you helped write those final words.
I didn't really, but I thought them and believed them.
That evening, she did record this entry in her diary.
And there we were in the familiar Oval Office of the president. The floor a jungle of cables under the brilliant glare of TV lights. What a stage setting. Lyndon, very quiet, sat at his desk, and the seconds ticked away.
You wrote that you walked over to where he was sitting, leaned down, and gave him some advice. Do you remember what you said?
Space yourself. Be very clear and firm, and give it all the drama that it has.
That's exactly what you said. You went over to him and said quietly, remember pacing and drama. Mm-hmm. It was a great speech. I wanted him to get the greatest out of it, and I didn't know what the end would be. You thought it was still possible.
Well, I thought it was still possible. Because you just think of all those people you disappoint. It was just like turning your back on your comrades.
That night, Lyndon Johnson delivered another of 1968's great shocks.
I shall not seek, and I will not accept the nomination of my party for another term as your president.
Afterwards, Lucy and Linda walk over and hug him. You leave the room together. Were you feeling relief or second thoughts?
Yes, like I was 25 pounds lighter and the way was clear in front of me.
Afterwards, you wrote, "The speech was magnificently delivered. Those who love him must have loved him more, and those who hate him must at least have thought, here is a man."
I could still say that.
One of the towering figures in America had fallen. 4 days later, a bullet would take another.
Like anybody, I would like to live a long life. Longevity has its place.
We were committed to redeem the soul of America. We weren't committed to stay alive.
Just want to do God's will.
And Martin said over and over again, if you're not willing to die for your country, you're not fit to live in it.
Well, I don't know what will happen now. We've got some difficult days ahead. But it really doesn't matter with me now, because I've been to the mountaintop.
You have to have a faith and believe that somehow you're doing the right thing. And if you're doing the right thing and you have to die, then the cause itself will be advanced.
I may not get there with you, but I want you to know tonight that we as a people will get to the promised land.
On April 3rd, Martin Luther King Jr. gave what would be his final speech in Memphis, Tennessee. He was troubled that a march he had led a week earlier had turned violent. He had returned to Memphis determined to show nonviolence still worked. And aides like Andrew Young began to see King's mood lighten.
He picked up a pillow and threw it at me, you know, and he was really clowning. So I threw the pillow back at him. It was just a kind of frivolity that you very seldom saw from him.
It was April 4th, on an evening that felt perfectly ordinary. King was on the balcony outside his motel room.
And a shot rang out. Actually, I thought it was a car backfiring or, you know, or a firecracker. But I looked up, and there he was in a pool of his own blood. I reached down to try to check his pulse, but it was clear that the bullet had entered the tip of his chin and had taken half of his spinal cord off. And so there was no way he could be alive for long.
We interrupt this program to bring you the following special report.
The Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King.
At home in Atlanta, Coretta Scott King heard the news bulletin that her husband had been shot. Did you know in your heart that your husband had died?
I had a sense that this was it. And I mean, Martin and I talked about it over the years. And I knew at some point this was going to happen.
You say it was going to happen, not that it could happen.
Yes, I felt that it was going to happen. And what you do, you try to prepare yourself as best you can. There's no way you can fully prepare. But I thought about the children, first of all, and I prayed that they would be old enough to remember him.
This is the end. Yes, if you want to say that I was a drum major, say that I was a drum major for justice. This is the end. Say that I was a drum major for peace. My only friend, the end. Somebody's asking how long will prejudice blind the visions of men? How long? Not long. Because no lie.
By 1968, King was one of the most loved and admired figures in the world. Preaching nonviolence, he had led a revolution.
I have a dream. It is a dream deeply rooted in the
In less than a decade, he had taken control of the civil rights movement and forced white America to confront the shame of its racism. But the change did not come easily. There were daily threats on King's life. The strain and the work wore on him.
The last meeting we had with him, he said, look, you all are letting this fall too much on me. It's time you all started carrying your own weight. His death forced us to do that. those of us who could.
His funeral on April 9th was broadcast to the world. The man who won the Nobel Peace Prize had been assassinated at the age of 39.
I remember seeing a photograph of myself that had a slight, almost like a smile on my face. And I know why. It's because I was listening to the beautiful music, and it was so painfully beautiful.
I am tired.
And so I was so pleased because I thought Martin would have been pleased, you know.
150,000 mourners followed the slow-paced casket through the somber streets of Atlanta. Andy Young wondered if his friend Martin's beliefs would survive his death.
All of us were trying as soon as possible to get the word out that the worst thing you could do in Martin Luther King's memory was violence, and that we had to try to keep people from reacting violently to this.
There must be some kind of way out of here.
It was too late. Rioting erupted in more than 100 cities across America.
There's too much confusion.
The worst of it was in Washington, D.C., and militants promised things would get even worse.
When white America killed Dr. King last night, she opened the eyes for every black man in this country. He was the one man in our race who was trying to teach our people to have love, passion, and mercy. White America killed Dr. King last night. She declared war on us.
What would Dr. King have thought of the riots after his assassination?
He would have been disappointed that people reacted in violence, but he would have understood it.
He would have understood the anger and the frustration.
The frustration. When people feel that they have no way out, then they turn to violence.
Washington was being looted and burned by thousands of rioters, including Tyrone Parker, then 21 years old.
I joined in on a golden opportunity in D.C.
A golden opportunity?
I said golden opportunity because I didn't have a means to express myself in regards to the hurt and the pain and the things that was occurring. So when this happened, this was no more than just another opportunity to be able to strike out or strike back.
At the establishment?
At the establishment.
That night, Parker was shot while trying to rob a bank. A year later, he went to prison for 8 years for armed robbery. By the time he got out, Washington was changing. Crime got worse. Drug use got worse. In 1991, D.C. was on its way to becoming the murder capital of the country, with 482 killings. Many of the victims were young black men. One of them was Tyrone Parker's son, Rodney.
That's right. You got it again, Eric.
That's when Parker and 4 old friends decided to start a nonviolence movement of their own. They called themselves the Alliance of Concerned Men. Pete Jackson, Mac Alsobrooks, Rico Rush, Eric Johnson.
We got the right to go out there and work with our kids.
They had all been in trouble. 4 had been in jail. They swore to try to stop the killing. What's surprising is how they've succeeded. What made you decide to start an organization to help young people?
Knowing that the guys that I knew had the answers because they were a part of the problems. Knowing that if a difference would be made or could be made, that we'd have to be the ones to step forth to make it.
Today, you can find them in the city's most dangerous neighborhoods, where people can get shot any day of the week. There are gangs in these apartments, and normal families too, children and teenagers with choices to make. That's why the Alliance is here.
Making sure when them little kids start talking about, I ain't going back to school, you step up and say, yes, you are. You're going to stay in school. You got to make them understand that their life is worthy of changing. They are worthy of changing. And if you can get this across to them, then you got a better human being. You got somebody that's giving to the community.
The group started with one person, one idea, just like you. Just like you. You know the deal. All things in time, though. You know.
So we ain't gonna let you fall down.
You know the deal.
After the gang execution of a 12-year-old boy in one D.C. neighborhood, the Alliance of Concerned Men virtually moved in. Within 2 weeks, the gangs were cleaning up their graffiti. By talking and listening and caring, the kinds of methods Martin Luther King liked to use, the Alliance cut gang violence practically to zero. What made you think that you could do it?
Because of where I was from.
But you know, you've been there before.
Mm-hmm.
There are people who say, look, I've been there, I know what it's like, let me tell you what it's like, and it still doesn't work.
When we embraced these kids, we didn't just say, this is how it's supposed to be. It was a process. Put your guns down and listen. Do you trust me? Will you walk with me to see if it's something that I can relate to you and help you with? You might get a job out of this. Suppose you do have the opportunity to work. Will you work?
The answer is yes. The Alliance has found jobs with city agencies for more than 150 former gang members, boys and girls. Kids who were killing each other are now working together.
You did a good job.
How do you convince them to take a job for $6.50 an hour when they can make a lot more money selling drugs?
When you give a young person the opportunity to change their life, they'll take $6.50 and they might take less than that. The primary is that you want to live beyond anything. You want to survive.
Mr. Parker is a founding member of the Alliance.
The Alliance is so effective, the House Judiciary Committee asked members to share their secret. It's simple, the men said. Caring and commitment to your neighborhood.
The Alliance of Concerned Men will be there by our children's side when there are times of need. And we will turn these brothers into what we know they can and will be. Good law-abiding citizens, able to say, don't step on that grass, because I placed it there.
Oh, yeah.
They receive some grants to support their work. It doesn't pay much.
Just have to put a little meat on there.
But what do you suppose that smile is worth on an afternoon shopping spree to buy a couple of reformed gang members their first suits? They want to look good. There's a big event to celebrate.
Tyrone Curtis Parker of the Alliance of Concerned Men.
Almost 100 of the kids they've helped showed up to see a national urban group honor the Alliance of Concerned Men and Tyrone Parker.
If I could take my trophy and cut it in pieces, I would give it to you, the kids that's out there, because you're the real heroes.
30 years ago, during one of the worst moments in American history, Tyrone Parker looted and robbed. Today, he's working to keep Dr. King's dream alive.
And I think that our work is a perfect example of his work. And I think that if he was here today, he would be just tickled to see the type of work that you have the Alliance of Concerned Men are doing. Men wrapping their arms around children to show them that they too have a dream.
One figure in 1968 who stirred hope in many Americans. The shy but intense man everyone called Bobby. For the people who believed in him, his assassination that summer at the age of 42 was like the death of hope. Carrie was the seventh of his 11 children. Tonight, she's going to help us remember him. She was 8 years old when her father died. Tell me what it was when he walked in a room.
A tremendous sense of excitement. And, you know, I think that what he brought out in people, and I think what he brought out in all of us, and was kind of the best part of our being. So it was wonderful to be around him, not because of who he was so much, but because of who we became. We became the best swimmers. We became the best runners.
And he made them the best campaigners, too. In March, Senator Kennedy entered the race for president and barnstormed through 16 states in a month. I have to win through the people, Kennedy said. His kids saw him connecting with people as no one else could.
Just going out on the campaign trail and seeing thousands and thousands of people reaching for him. And he was often in a convertible. And there would have to be literally two men holding on to him with all their might, like this, hugging him to keep him in the car because the crowds were grabbing for him so much. I just remember his hands, and they were all red and totally swollen. And there was kind of a running joke about finding him new cufflinks because every day he went out, he would get cufflinks from people grabbing him.
He made people believe in themselves. They could stop the war, promote justice, care about the poor, because he told them they could, with powerful words heard around the world.
Each time a man stands up for an ideal, or acts to improve the lot of others, or strikes out against injustice, he sends forth a tiny ripple of hope, and crossing each other from a million different centers of energy and daring. Those ripples
build a current that will sweep down the mightiest walls of oppression and resistance.
Its power is undiminished, isn't it?
It is. They really personified my father's vision of life and what we're put on this earth for.
In June, he brought his campaign to California. To win the Democratic nomination, he would have to win that primary.
He came to California with a week to go, and it was a frenzied, exhausting week. Very, very difficult.
Frank Makowitz was campaign press secretary.
Exhausting campaigning, and I think that was part of his mood, which was, I just want to rest.
Instead of rest, he campaigned harder. On the day before the vote, he traveled throughout the entire state. And on primary night, Kennedy's supporters celebrated their most important victory. John Lewis, now a Georgia congressman, was a civil rights activist, a close friend of Kennedy, and with him that night.
He joked with me that evening. He said, "John, you let me down. More Mexican-American turnout and voted than Negroes." It was sort of a joke. He was sort of playing with me.
Wait here, I'll be back in 20 minutes, Bobby Kennedy said to John Lewis. Then he and Frank Makowitz went down to greet the crowd.
He exulted in the fact that he had won big, not only in California, but in South Dakota. But he didn't seem to me as ebullient and full of energy as he had been on other similar occasions.
In the ballroom of the Ambassador Hotel, he was closer than ever to reviving the legacy of his assassinated brother, President John Kennedy. With his wife, Ethel, Bobby stood at the podium.
Thanks to all of you, and now it's on to Chicago, and let's win there.
Those were the last words we would ever hear him say. It was after midnight. Kennedy was exhausted, but still had to talk to reporters in the press room. His aides followed him off the back of the platform and headed for a shortcut through the hotel kitchen.
And Ethel called to us, wanted some help in getting down from the platform. She was at the time 3 months pregnant, although I don't think anybody knew it except the inside group. So we helped her down, and then she said, "Go on," and we started to move off quickly to catch up. And that's when we heard the shot.
Get the gun! Get the gun! Get the gun! Stay away from the gun! Get his thumb! Get his thumb! Get his thumb!
Oh, my God. Senator Kennedy has been shot. And another man, a Kennedy campaign manager, and possibly shot in the head.
The man who fired the revolver was a hotel kitchen worker, a Palestinian zealot named Sirhan Sirhan. Kennedy was shot 3 times.
He was almost totally unconscious. He said the word no at one point as people were lifting him.
Ladies and gentlemen, we've kept the air on because we've heard an alarming report that Robert Kennedy was shot in that
bulletin came on.
Upstairs, John Lewis and other staffers were watching the news.
And we all dropped to the floor of the hotel. At that moment, we all started to cry. And I started saying to myself, why?
For 24 hours, the entire country, bent with sorrow, waited.
Senator Robert Francis Kennedy died at 1:44 a.m. today, June 6, 1968.
2 months after the assassination of Dr. King, the most respected and the most powerful people in America assembled for another sudden funeral, this time at St. Patrick's Cathedral in New York. The last of the brothers, Massachusetts Senator Ted Kennedy, gave the eulogy.
Those of us who loved him and who take him to his rest today pray that what he promised to us and what he wished for others will someday come to pass for all the world. As he said many times in many parts of this nation, to those he touched and who sought to touch him, some men see things as they are and say why. I dream things that never were and say why not.
A funeral train carried the body from New York to Washington.
But all along the way, you saw people crying. And you saw people carrying handmade signs, saying, "Goodbye, Bobby. We love you, Bobby." You saw mothers and fathers holding their children, their babies. I do remember young Joe Kennedy walking the length of that train, shaking hands with every single person. And this young child thanking people for being there.
As the train passed through Baltimore, the Kennedy family could hear mourners outside singing the Battle Hymn of the Republic. When I think of the train ride and all of you on it, the temptation it must have been to blame politics, to blame the country. Because in the country at the time, so many people said, what has happened to this country?
Yeah.
What is it with this country?
Yeah. Of course, it sounds trite to even say it, but of course it would have been better if he had lived. But it would be better if Lincoln was alive. It would be better if Thomas Jefferson was here. But that's not what God's given us. He's given us what we have, and we have to find our own way of dealing with our issues and trying to make our country everything that it can be. And then we're going to just walk around this little circle here.
Honoring his vision has become the family's tribute to him. For 30 years, the Robert Kennedy Memorial Foundation has supported the kinds of people and projects he defended. Ethel Kennedy started the foundation. Daughter Carrie has served as executive director.
You know, my father believed that one person can make a difference and that each of us needs to try and do that. So we look for people who are making a difference, who have shown some leadership and who are working on civil rights issues in their own country, just as he worked on civil rights here in the United States.
This year, the Kennedy Memorial helped organize a global march against child labor and brought Kailash Satyarthi, one of its leaders, to Washington. He's a Kennedy hero for rescuing 28,000 kids from child labor in India. And so is Father Greg Boyle. Last summer, Kerry visited the priest in Los Angeles, where he spent 12 years in one of America's poorest neighborhoods, Pico Aliso. The Kennedy Memorial supports Impacto, his program to save the youngest and most vulnerable kids from gangs.
He has a great presence. He brings out in the community that is used to this great violence. He really brings out the humanity.
You might want to escort those guys
and he's done an extraordinary job.
8 gangs are fighting for territory in 1 square mile of his parish.
Wedding day. A wedding you'll never forget.
Even at a wedding, Greg Boyle knows to expect trouble. The groom he just married is about to be arrested. In Pico Aliso, 24 hours a day, things need fixing, and most often, the man who does it is the man everyone simply calls Father Greg.
Thanks a lot, guys. I appreciate it. All right, you're welcome.
For Carrie, the words of her father echo in the life and work of Father Greg.
Heroic people, really, that's what this community is about. Kids in particular, they manage to navigate the waters of their adolescence against all odds.
While Carrie was in Los Angeles, Father Greg introduced her to a woman whose 12-year-old grandson, a boy who had stayed out of gangs, was killed in a drive-by shooting.
Just the cutest kid.
Roberto was her second grandchild to be murdered.
If you don't like meth, you won't last very long here. This is all about meth, the messiness of life and humanity and and the struggle of every day to feed kids and buy Pampers and to somehow eke out an existence for your family and your children.
That's your brother right there. How you gonna be talking about your brother that way?
Robert Kennedy died 30 years ago. But by helping Greg Boyle and others like him, the Kennedy Foundation is building a monument to what Robert Kennedy lived for.
Each time a man stands up for an ideal, or acts to improve the lot of others, or strikes out against injustice, he sends forth a tiny ripple of hope.
There was still one figure in 1968 who stirred hope in many Americans. The shy but intense man everyone called Bobby. For the people who believed in him, his assassination that summer at the age of 42 was like the death of hope. Carrie was the seventh of his 11 children. Tonight, she's going to help us remember him. She was 8 years old when her father died.
Tell me what it was when he walked in a room.
A tremendous sense of excitement. And, I think that what he brought out in people, and I think what he brought out in all of us, and was kind of the best part of our being. So it was wonderful to be around him, not because of who he was so much, but because of who we became. We became the best swimmers. We became the best runners.
And he made them the best campaigners, too. In March, Senator Kennedy entered the race for president and barnstormed through 16 states in a month. I have to win through the people, Kennedy said. His kids saw him connecting with people as no one else could.
Just going out on the campaign trail and seeing thousands and thousands of people reaching for him. And he was often in a convertible. And there would have to be literally two men holding on to him with all their might, like this, hugging him to keep him in the car because the crowds were grabbing for him so much. I just remember his hands, and they were all red and totally swollen. And there was kind of a running joke about finding him new cufflinks because every day he went out, he would lose his cufflinks from people grabbing him.
He made people believe in themselves. They could stop the war, promote justice, care about the poor, because he told them they could, with powerful words heard around the world.
Each time a man stands up for an ideal, or acts to improve the lot of others, or strikes out against injustice, he sends forth a tiny ripple of hope, and crossing each other from a million different centers of energy and daring. Those ripples
build a current that will sweep down the mightiest walls of oppression and resistance.
Its power is undiminished, isn't it?
It is. They really personified my father's vision of life and what we're put on this earth for.
In June, he brought his campaign to California. To win the Democratic nomination, he would have to win that primary.
He came to California with a week to go, and it was a frenzied, exhausting week. Very, very difficult.
Frank Makowitz was campaign press secretary.
Exhausting campaigning, and I think that was part of his mood, which was, I just want to rest.
Instead of rest, he campaigned harder. On the day before the vote, he traveled throughout the entire state. And on primary night, Kennedy's supporters celebrated their most important victory. John Lewis, now a Georgia congressman, was a civil rights activist, a close friend of Kennedy, and with him that night.
He joked with me that evening. He said, "John, you let me down. More Mexican-Americans turned out and voted than Negroes." It was sort of a joke. He was sort of playing with me.
Wait here, I'll be back in 20 minutes, Bobby Kennedy said to John Lewis. Then he and Frank Makowitz went down to greet the crowd.
He exulted in the fact that he had won big, not only in California, but in South Dakota. But he didn't seem to me as ebullient and full of energy as he had been on other similar occasions.
In the ballroom of the Ambassador Hotel, he was closer than ever to reviving the legacy of his assassinated brother, President John Kennedy. With his wife, Ethel, Bobby stood at the podium.
I thanks to all of you, and now it's on to Chicago, and let's win there.
Those were the last words we would ever hear him say. It was after midnight. Kennedy was exhausted, but still had to talk to reporters in the press room. His aides followed him off the back of the platform and headed for a shortcut through the hotel kitchen.
And Ethel called to us, wanted some help in getting down from the platform. She was at the time 3 months pregnant, although I don't think anybody knew it, except the inside group. So we helped her down, and then she said, go on. And we started to move off quickly to catch up. And that's when we heard the shot.
Get the gun. Get the gun. Get the gun. Stay away from the gun. Get his thumb. Get his thumb. Get his thumb.
Oh, my God. Senator Kennedy has been shot. And another man, a Kennedy campaign manager, and possibly shot in the head.
The man who fired the revolver was a hotel kitchen worker, a Palestinian zealot named Sirhan Sirhan. Kennedy was shot 3 times.
He was almost totally unconscious. He said the word no at one point as people were lifting him.
Ladies and gentlemen, we've kept the air on because we've heard an alarming report that Robert Kennedy was shot in
The
that
bulletin came on,
Upstairs, John Lewis and other staffers were watching the news.
and we all dropped to the floor of the hotel. In that room, we all started to cry. And I started saying to myself, why?
For 24 hours, the entire country, bent with sorrow, waited.
Senator Robert Francis Kennedy died at 1:44 a.m. today, June 6, 1968.
2 months after the assassination of Dr. King, the most respected and the most powerful people in America assembled for another sudden funeral, this time at St. Patrick's Cathedral in New York. The last of the brothers, Massachusetts Senator Ted Kennedy, gave the eulogy.
Those of us who loved him and who take him to his rest today pray that what he promised to us and what he wished for others will someday come to pass for all the world. As he said many times in many parts of this nation, to those he touched and who sought to touch him, some men see things as they are and say why. I dream things that never were and say why not.
A funeral train carried the body from New York to Washington.
But all along the way, you saw people cry, and you saw people carrying handmade signs, saying, goodbye, Bobby, we love you, Bobby. You saw mothers and fathers holding their children, their babies. I do remember young Joe Kennedy walking the length of that train, shaking hands with every single person. And this young child thanking people for being there.
As the train passed through Baltimore, the Kennedy family could hear mourners outside singing the battle hymn of the Republic. When I think of the train rides and all of you on it, the temptation it must have been to blame politics, to blame the country. Because in the country at the time, so many people said, what has happened to this country?
Yeah.
What is it with this country?
Yeah. Of course, it sounds trite to even say it, but of course it would have been better if he had lived. But it would be better if Lincoln was alive. It would be better if Thomas Jefferson was here. But that's not what God's given us. He's given us what we have, and we have to find our own way of dealing with our issues and trying to make our country everything that it can be. And then we're going to just walk around this little circle here.
Honoring his vision has become the family's tribute to him. For 30 years, the Robert Kennedy Memorial Foundation has supported the kinds of people and projects he defended. Ethel Kennedy started the foundation. Daughter Carrie has served as executive director.
You know, my father believed that one person can make a difference and that each of us needs to try and do that. So we look for people who are making a difference, who have shown some leadership and who are working on civil rights issues in their own country, just as he worked on civil rights here in the United States.
This year, the Kennedy Memorial helped organize a global march against child labor and brought Kailash Satyarthi, one of its leaders, to Washington. He's a Kennedy hero for rescuing 28,000 kids from child labor in India. And so is Father Greg Boyle. Last summer, Kerry visited the priest in Los Angeles, where he spent 12 years in one of America's poorest neighborhoods, Pico Aliso. The Kennedy Memorial supports Impacto, his program to save the youngest and most vulnerable kids from gangs.
He has a great presence. He brings out in a community that is used to this great violence. He really brings out the humanity.
You might want to escort those guys
And he's done an extraordinary job.
8 gangs are fighting for territory in 1 square mile of his parish.
Wedding day. A wedding you'll never forget.
Even at a wedding, Greg Boyle knows to expect trouble. The groom he just married is about to be arrested. In Pico Aliso, 24 hours a day, things need fixing, and most often, the man who does it is the man everyone simply calls Father Greg.
Thanks a lot, guys. I appreciate it. All right, you're welcome.
For Carrie, the words of her father echo in the life and work of Father Greg.
Heroic people, really, that's what this community is about. Kids in particular, they manage to navigate the waters of their adolescence against all odds.
While Carrie was in Los Angeles, Father Greg introduced her to a woman whose 12-year-old grandson, a boy who had stayed out of gangs, was killed in a drive-by shooting.
Just the cutest kid.
Roberto was her second grandchild to be murdered.
If you don't like mess, you won't last very long here. This is all about mess. The messiness of life and humanity and the struggle of every day to feed kids and buy Pampers and to somehow eke out an existence for your family and your children.
That's your brother right there. How are you going to be talking about your brother that way?
Robert Kennedy died 30 years ago. But by helping Greg Boyle and others like him, the Kennedy Foundation is building a monument to what Robert Kennedy lived for.
Each time a man stands up for an ideal, or acts to improve the lot of others, or strikes out against injustice, he sends forth a tiny ripple of hope.
In August, Democrats came to Chicago for their convention, hoping for a family reunion. Mayor Daley had the city spruced up and ready for company. But all the familiar turmoil of 1968 was there too, crackling like a summer storm.
The Democratic family was bitterly divided. Many were unwelcome. Some of the young people who came here would be changed forever by what was about to happen in downtown Chicago, including a New Jersey farm boy, idealistic enough to believe protests might end the war, David Mixner.
When I landed at the plane, I walked off the plane and got in a cab to go into downtown Chicago, and there were troops and helmets and face guards and bayonets everywhere.
Mixner's candidate was Senator Eugene McCarthy. So many kids had joined his campaign that people called it the Children's Crusade. They had already helped force President Johnson out of the race. Now they were in Chicago, to win the nomination and stop the war. Did you realistically believe that Eugene McCarthy could become president?
We believed we could change the world back then. We really believed we could end the war. And we worked 18 hours a day, 7 days a week, because every hour we didn't work was an hour someone was dying in Vietnam, and that's how we felt.
Vice President Hubert Humphrey, a perpetually sunny man, arrived in Chicago knowing the nomination was probably his, but also knowing that he was a man in trouble. Humphrey worried Johnson's war policy would lose the election. He wanted to stop the bombing, but feared the president's anger, and so said nothing. Skip Humphrey, then a 25-year-old law student, was working on his father's campaign. How much did you know about your father's disagreement with President Johnson on his Vietnam policy?
He had already prepared the memorandum some years before that had indicated that, look, we ought to be out of this war. This isn't the right place for us. It's not the right way.
But you knew he was living with the fact that he disagreed?
He was frustrated with the decisions of the administration, but he was also loyal to this administration. Understand that.
Bill Ayers understood that. He was a leader of the radical group Students for a Democratic Society. He came to Chicago to embarrass the party.
Did you plaster Hubert Humphrey's headquarters with graffiti, murderer?
Yes.
Why call Hubert Humphrey a murderer?
You can look back and say, poor Hubert Humphrey. He was caught in a terrible dilemma and bind. But that's not how we experienced it. We experienced it as the face of hypocrisy and murder and aggression. And we saw Humphrey not writhing, but bowing.
There's no way to describe what is going on in here, except it's going on in front of us, behind us, arguments with the police.
Finally, the anger and confusion over Vietnam burst through the doors of the Chicago Convention. Inside, Democrats debated what the party should do about Vietnam. The debate turned into a civil war.
Will the convention be in order?
To keep control, party leaders banned anti-war signs from the floor. Delegates smuggled them in anyway, crumpled but defiant. It was a historic moment, but not the one Chicago's Mayor Daley had planned.
This convention is held for the delegates of the great Democratic Party, not for anyone in any balcony trying to take over this meeting.
And Mayor Daley would sit on the front row and give directions to whoever, Carl Albert was running the convention, and tell him what to do, the Speaker of the House of Representatives at the time, and the Wisconsin delegation and the California delegation, which were big, powerful anti-war delegations. Every time someone in those delegations would get up to speak, they'd be cut off. Their mics would be cut down.
On the third night, the delegates were set to vote on Vietnam. Watching on television from his Texas ranch, President Johnson was still powerful enough to crush dissent. He sent word of his disapproval. The peace platform was defeated.
They voted down our idealism. They took our idealism away that night. We sat there with tears coming down our face, and then we just walked out. And we went and joined the demonstrators.
This is what they found in Grant Park in front of the hotel headquarters of Humphrey and McCarthy. Word spread that the convention had voted down the peace platform. It was a hot, tense night. Soldiers, police, protesters. The air felt ready to explode. And it did.
And they didn't order us to disperse. They corralled us. We were like cattle, pinned in. And on all four sides were police in riot gear and helmets and nightsticks. And they had gloved hands. And they had removed their name tags. And they were taking their sticks and they were hitting them in a case in their gloved hands, saying, kill, 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 kill. This had been gone 5 days, and they had reached the end of their patience.
It became exactly the exposure of what looked to us very much like a police state, what looked to us very much like the police in charge, and the hard crazies running the show.
And they started going in from all four sides, beating the crowd. I went into the fetal position, and I remember 3 or 4 officers just pounding on my side and on my right leg with all their force with billy clubs. I wasn't moving, I wasn't fighting back. None of us were. We just wanted out of there.
There's no running away. There'll be no one to save. Will the world integrate? Take a look around you, boy.
There were people dragging themselves off, trying to get help, moaning, screaming, asking for help. Except the people who were supposed to help us were the ones who had done it.
In his hotel suite, high above the rioters, Hubert Humphrey was watching the convention on television as he was being nominated.
I remember it was blistering hot. We were up at the top of the hotel, and it was so hot in the hotel that we opened the windows, and of course it came floating in, tear gas, and you could hear the noise down below. I'm thinking, my father has just been nominated to be President of the United States of America, and there are armed forces with fixed bayonets down below. This is crazy.
The great moment for Hubert Horatio Humphrey after a long, long journey.
The next night, Humphrey, the happy warrior, accepted the nomination, even as he knew the riots outside were crippling his chance of winning.
Humphrey's son and his wife.
I'm also thinking about you looking at kids your age outside protesting while you were inside.
Some of my good friends,
Were
some
there?
of my classmates.
Were there?
Yeah.
Did you feel torn?
I felt that protests here, we don't need that. We have a process here and a government here that can change merely by its traditional process. If you don't like the people that are in office, then work hard to get them out and put the right people in.
Work hard, like his father did, but the result was a crushing blow. He lost to Richard Nixon by just 500,000 votes.
Your father, did he say anything to you about what he had learned from his life?
Don't run away from what you've been given. I'm not going to give you a lot of money, and I hope I've given you a good name. Build on that.
You can remember Humphrey. I'd like to work for you.
And he has, 30 years after his father lost the race for president, 20 years after his father died. Skip Humphrey is finishing out his days as Minnesota's Attorney General, a job he gave up to run for governor this year.
See you.
Yeah, I knew your dad.
Yeah, oh really?
He has his father's sweetness and passion for politics and family.
Time for the DQ.
After 25 years in law and public service, the biggest criticism? He's nice. Maybe too vanilla nice for his own good.
Good morning,
Then
everybody.
4 years ago, that nice kid who believed in working within the system found a way to use the system to take a powerful stand. It was Skip Humphrey who filed the nation's first state lawsuit against tobacco companies for consumer fraud. 2 years later, when it looked as though the companies might settle with the state, Humphrey got tough. No, he said, I'm going to court.
What was the moment at which you decided to go after the tobacco company?
I can tell you when things gelled.
When?
They gelled when Henry Waxman presented all of those documents to Congress.
Did you see the executives? Did you see the testimony?
Well, I saw them all stand there and say, no, it's not addictive. Nicotine is not addictive.
I don't believe that nicotine or our products are addictive.
I believe nicotine is not addictive.
I believe that nicotine is not addictive.
You said in the lawsuit you filed that this was unlawful, conspiratorial, indecent, and amoral. Amoral. These men, these people,
in these companies?
When you know that the product you are selling addicts people, when you target children, kids, our kids, as early as age 5, and you know that 1/3 of those that start smoking and continue to smoke are going to die with certainty, and then you go out and you tell the public that you don't know that, if that's not immoral, I don't know what is. But it's also illegal. And that's what we took our action based upon.
Why this issue? I mean, alcohol hurts a lot of people. Why tobacco?
Nothing hurts people in America more in terms of their health than tobacco.
Do you believe that's what killed your father?
Well, I now know that's what killed my father.
He had
His
smoked.
bladder and colon cancer were directly related to his smoking.
Last May, just before the case was to go to the jury, the tobacco companies gave up. They settled for more than $6 billion.
Ladies and gentlemen, this is truly a historic day. The tobacco industry has surrendered, and they have surrendered on our terms.
Did you get everything you wanted?
Everything and a whole lot more. We more than doubled what we sued for. But more importantly, we got the protections for our children.
Minnesota now has the toughest anti-smoking program in the country. The tobacco companies will be paying for a lot of it.
All of those signs, the signs back here, like that Marlboro one, guess what? That's the last stand of the Marlboro man. He's going down.
After the tobacco victory, it looked as if Skip Humphrey's story would have a happy ending in the governor's race.
And the American dream lives on in
But
Minnesota.
last night, with a bizarre political twist, the frontrunner lost to a big-talking, big-muscled former pro wrestler, Jesse the Body Ventura. He's going to the governor's mansion. Skip Humphrey is going back home. But for a nice man in politics these days, maybe that's the best place to look for happy endings after all. In a moment, the demonstrators, who also wanted to change the world in 1968, but whose lives followed very different paths.
A year after the 1968 Democratic Convention, a study called What Had Happened in Chicago, quote, a police riot. Among the victims was that McCarthy campaign worker, David Mixner.
And I remember 3 or 4 officers just pounding on my side and on my right leg. And I wasn't moving, I wasn't fighting back. None of us were. We just wanted out of there.
Why didn't you fight that?
Violence creates more violence. Dr. King was our teacher. He taught us that if we fought back, we became like them.
Today, he's still in politics. If anything, his cause now is more controversial than the anti-war movement.
And I'm different. Different from probably all of you, if not most of you.
And more personal, too.
See, I'm a gay man. And it used to haunt me. I used to feel real bad about myself.
When he speaks to straight audiences, his message is tolerance.
It is always good to be with brothers and sisters.
When he speaks to gays, he urges them to get tough.
And we're about to enter, it appears, another time of great struggle. We've seen an increased epidemic of hate crimes directed towards gays and lesbians. We've seen the majority leader of the United States Senate compare us to kleptomaniacs and sick people. And it took me until I was 30 years old to come to terms with the fact that I should be celebrating who I am, that I was created who I am, and that I had to live it in order to honor who I was.
When you were a demonstrator, you were with young people who felt the same way you did, and you weren't able to tell them the truth about yourself.
That's right. In fact, if I had told them the truth about myself, I would not have been allowed to be in the McCarthy campaign. Back at that time.
And would they have accepted you?
No, absolutely not. Some would have earned their liberal stripes by tolerating me.
For years, he barely tolerated himself. Drinking, drugs, breakdowns. That's past now.
My feet ache, my teeth ache.
He got through the hard times with help from friends, including his sister. They still talk by phone every morning.
That was the agreement you reached.
He works from his home in Los Angeles, writing and organizing for the gay rights cause, where he's something of a hero.
It is my great privilege to present a gay, gentle leader, David Mixner.
Sometimes the activist is back where he started, at the rallies, on the podium.
We are here to give testimony to our own resolve and the determination to be free at last of the slavery of self-hatred.
Your critics say you think you're the Martin Luther King of gay rights. Your supporters say you are.
They're both wrong. They're both wrong. There's only one Dr. Martin Luther King, first of all. He's a man that comes along once in a century. I just do what I believe in.
What that means, he says, is doing what he thinks is right. So 6 years ago, when an old friend from the 60s was running for president, Mixner wanted to know if Bill Clinton would do what was right for the gay community.
I presume he passed the test.
He did with flying colors.
So you gathered up forces?
We gathered up a lot of support.
Money?
Over $4 million.
On the night Bill Clinton won, gays and lesbians celebrated his triumph as their own.
You probably thought that you had the first president in the White House who was going to pay real attention to gay rights.
I didn't think it. He told us. He told us, you see. And we believed it because he told us.
When gays in the military became the new administration's first hot issue, David Mixner wasn't marching. He was inside the White House, advising. And it seemed to be working.
Our interest is to
President Clinton said he would order that gays could serve openly. But then he was asked if the military would house everyone together or segregate the gays.
That depends on what the report says. That's why I'm waiting for the Secretary of Defense to issue the report. But I wouldn't rule that out depending on what the grounds and arguments were.
To gays, segregation sounded like betrayal. And when Nightline called, David Mixner went on to say so.
We were so sure that this president was committed to this cause 100%.
He told us he had a vision and that we were a part of it and that our talents and our skills could be used at last by this nation. We feel vulnerable today. We feel exposed. We feel unprotected.
That didn't sit well with the White House.
That's when I was shut out.
You knew that what you were going to do was going to alienate him.
It wasn't whether the President of the United States liked me. That wasn't the issue. The issue was lives that were being destroyed. Well, it's what was right.
We're back to that again.
Yes, of course we are. And for me to have remained silent for his political expediency would have been a crime.
That summer, when Bill Clinton signed the Don't Ask, Don't Tell compromise into law, gay protesters chained themselves to the White House fence. Almost a dozen were arrested, including the president's friend and advisor, David Mixner.
A cynic would say President Clinton lied to you.
I don't think he lied to me. I don't really believe he lied to me.
In 1968, you would have said
he made a campaign
that
promise.
politician lied to you.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. I would have accused him of being a liar. I would have used the word betrayal. And I guess I've learned some things since then. When you shut the door so tightly, when you cut off dialogue, when you make it impossible for people to even talk to each other, even in disagreement, you can't go anywhere.
The Democrats went to Chicago in 1968 and found the whole world watching their worst moments. But for some at the convention, the heady mix of cameras and chaos was just what they wanted.
To anti-war radical Bill Ayers, this was when the system revealed itself for what it was.
It became exactly the exposure of what looked to us very much like a police state, what looked to us very much like the police in charge and hard crazies running the show.
Were you scared?
We were scared, but we were also exhilarated. Here we were, 23, 24 years old. We felt that it was up to us to save the country and the world. That's a heavy burden for a 23-year-old, but that's what we felt.
You took it seriously?
Very seriously.
Oh, we took it
Deadly
too
seriously.
seriously.
He's married to Bernadine Dorn.
Well, we didn't have that great a sense of humor about ourselves at the time, or our own limitations.
Once a famously militant leader of the anti-war movement.
We were right to take it seriously. We thought
that the government was so wrong and had been lying to us. That's what's hard to remember. Now everybody assumes the government's lying all the time. But then, it was a different matter.
Today, the couple lives in Chicago, raising 3 boys. And at community events, who would guess that this baseball mom once tried to start a revolution less than 10 miles away?
And the inconsistent evidence that's come down from all the pigs who run this city is very clear.
In 1968, Bernadine Dorn and Bill Ayers were part of the student movement that gave up on peaceful protests to stop the war. They helped start a violent group called the Weathermen. In October of 1969, they organized the Chicago Street Rampage, the Days of Rage. Hundreds of weathermen were arrested. 6 were shot.
There's no way to commit it to nonviolence in the middle of the most violent society that history's ever created.
The weathermen started issuing communiques, this one from Bernadine Dorn, warning of bombings to come.
Within the next 14 days, we will attack a symbol or institution of American injustice.
They went on to attack a dozen targets across the country in the next few years. Government buildings, corporate headquarters, places they said were tied to the war.
Were any people injured or killed in those bombings? No one was killed. They destroyed property. They destroyed property. They destroyed war-related property. And they were, wait a minute, you were putting bombs in places where people did go.
And they went off at midnight. No.
What? You could have been a guard there. People called. You're saying you were a reliable bomber?
Absolutely.
It wasn't an accident that no one was hurt. This was about building an opposition. And the only way to build an opposition was to have symbolic acts, serious and militant and embarrassing to the government, but nonetheless restrained.
But their violence did claim victims. The bomb accidentally exploded in a weatherman apartment in New York. 3 of them died.
Your bombs killed your own people.
That's right. And that's completely right.
And everyone who knew them had their heart broken. And their families will never recover from the loss of their adulthood. There's no question about it. There was tragedy all over the place.
By this time, the FBI was after them. Dorn and Ayers were in hiding. Their fugitive life would last more than a decade.
What was life like on the run? Much more normal than you'd think. Well, you weren't looking over your shoulder.
Not at all. I mean, we had lives like other people had, with an exception, which is we lived under an assumed identity. We couldn't carry much with us. We were, carried our homes on our back.
In 1980, much of the FBI's evidence against Dorn and Ayers had been thrown out of court. So they gave themselves up. Bernadine Dorn pleaded guilty to minor charges and spent 3 years on probation. Neither served any time in jail.
A lot of people out there are probably saying, I would love to hear them say we were young, we were idealistic, we were foolish, and we were probably stupid, we made mistakes, and we're sorry about it. We're grown up now.
I'll say we were young, we were idealistic, we were romantic, we were foolish, we made mistakes.
And we'd do it again.
And I
wish that we'd done more. I wish we'd been more militant. I wish a lot of things. But taken as a whole, we were so lucky to be born into that moment in history.
Kids aren't listening, kids aren't working.
But are still social critics trying to live their principles. He's a professor of education who writes about kids and trains would-be teachers.
Now, if you know anything about 6-year-olds, they cannot sit in desks. You can't sit in a desk for 5 hours.
It was precisely 30 years ago that the legal, constitutional, and human rights of children...
She's a lawyer, though her own criminal record prevents her from actually practicing law. She heads a center at Northwestern University, devoted to legal reform for children.
What has happened to the lives of children in the last 30 years? We're jailing our children. We're expelling our children from schools. We're punishing our children. We've turned children and youth in America into the people we most fear. Well, what happened? In other words, your parents did it right. They brought you up so you were in a safe environment, so you could go out and do what you wanted to do and do it well. Your generation, our generation, is not doing that. Well, here's what's happened. Yes, that's right. We're not. Well, as a civil society. Then what happened to you? Where did your generation go wrong? One thing that's happened is we're building prisons instead of schools. Those are very simple choices. They're not unlike the choices that were faced in the 60s about a war budget, a bloated war budget. So I think that these, again, call on the fundamental questions of who we are as a people, how we'll be judged 100 years from now,
How we'll be remembered?
It's an interesting question for Bernadine Dorn and Bill Ayers. How to be remembered. Their violent weatherman past is inescapably part of who they are. But so is their open, welcoming home and the mix of kids always hanging around.
But you know, while they're wearing this den mother thing flies in the face of your past. If your children did what you did, would you be horrified or proud?
Oh, I'd be terrified and proud.
There is one final story you should know from the year 1968. A story about this man, Commander Pete Booker. He grew up in a world where rules were always black and white. His story is about courage and a shade of gray. When he surrendered his ship to North Korea and gave up far more than name, rank, and serial number, he forced us all to ask this question. How many men should die because of a military blunder?
Do you think of this event as one for shame or one of courage?
I think particularly for the crew, of courage and great service to our country.
And you?
I served it as well as I could, too. I'm not ashamed of anything I did.
USS Pueblo was designed and commissioned to conduct electronic espionage.
The North Koreans broadcast this confession. It was shocking. The skipper and crew of a U.S. Navy ship held hostage and forced to repudiate their government.
We are criminals who committed hostile acts. We are now most sincerely repentant.
Commander Pete Booker was 38 years old when he made that confession. Today, he's retired, in poor health, and living with his wife Rose in Southern California. Booker was the least likely person to star in a national drama. He grew up an orphan from Boys Town, a career Navy guy sent on what the government assured him was a sleepy assignment. Command of the USS Pueblo, a creaky so-called spy ship eavesdropping on communist North Korea.
Had you rehearsed what you would do if the ship were ever taken?
No, it was not a possibility. The whole mission had been judged to be non-threatening and without danger. We were so highly classified, nobody in the Navy knew who we were. When our message for help went out, Com 7th Fleet, whose area we were in, said, well, who the hell's the Pueblo?
That call for help went out on January 23rd when 4 Korean gunboats suddenly attacked the ship and her crewmen, including Stu Russell.
The second they opened fire on us, the whole world changed completely in favor for us. I was kind of wondering why my heart just didn't blow up. I've never been so terrified in my life.
Booker ordered the crew to destroy secret documents and radioed for help. The Navy had promised fighter jets if ever there was trouble, but help never came.
Why didn't you fire back?
Because we couldn't. There was nothing to fire back with. They gave us a 50 caliber machine gun, but I had nobody trained to use it. They wouldn't give me training time.
But there are a lot of people who think that you should have done anything you could, even taken the fire, gone down.
Well, if there had been a war on, I'm sure we would have died. I would have done that. But there's no war there, and I was told specifically when I left port there by Admiral Johnson, he said, now look, Booker, he says, you're not a dead cowboy out there. I don't want you starting World War III. I said, Admiral, I ain't starting your war for you.
Already wounded himself, Booker saw one of his men go down. He ordered the doctor to give the injured sailor more morphine.
He said if I give him any more morphine, it would, couldn't... he probably wouldn't make it. And so I told him, well, go ahead, because he was dying. And so we at least took him out of his misery there.
Booker surrendered. It was unthinkable in John Wayne America, where we were still living the Hollywood myth of a highly prepared, infallible military. The Pueblo was the first Navy ship to surrender during peacetime in 150 years, and an ill-equipped, unprepared captain and his 82 men were taken hostage.
How soon after they took you did the torture begin?
Immediately. It was mostly kicking, and then some gun butts, of course, rattle butts that were swung at people. I was rendered unconscious about 3 times in the first day or day and a half.
Did you think they were going to kill you?
Well, guy pulled out a revolver
And he put it to my head, and the only thing I could think of saying was, I love you, Rose, my wife. And and then that clicks down on an empty chamber, and it's like, God, it's like, it just echoes for a long time.
The North Koreans demanded public confessions and apologies. The captain says he had to choose, embarrass his country or lose the lives of his 82 men.
At one point, they showed you a South Korean captive, right?
They said it was a South Korean. He was badly beat up. His bone was breaking through his skin. He had apparently bit through his lip, and his eye was put out. They said, well, this is what they do to spies. And I was unprepared for that kind of sight. And they said, well, you either sign this thing or we start with your youngest guy and we start killing him until you sign it. And I said, well, to hell with it. I'll just sign it.
All your life, you had been trained for the moment at which you would give name, rank, serial number, and nothing else. Yeah. But did you say to yourself at that moment, I'm letting myself down?
Yeah, absolutely.
The men are provided with various...
As the months passed, the Koreans sent out propaganda films in which the men were forced to extol their humane treatment. But the crew managed to sneak their own message into some of the photos, a hand gesture for their captors that no American would misread.
One of the other Korean officers saw him. What's that mean? And the guy had enough head work to say, well, that's the Hawaiian good luck sign. And the guy says, Hawaiian good luck sign? Yeah, good luck.
The Koreans discovered the real meaning and took bloody revenge. Pete Booker heard the screams of his crewmen, but there was nothing he could do. And he worried about something else. As a naval officer, he did know some secrets about Navy ships and submarines. He feared, under torture, might yield.
And so I seriously considered suicide, and I tried to do that by drowning myself.
Drowning?
Well, everybody had a slop bucket where you could urinate. I talked myself into the fact that I ought to drown myself because otherwise I might somewhere or other give up information that I thought was very vital to this country. And I tried to do that, but I couldn't do it.
Did you feel responsible for your crew members?
Yes, that's my job. I was their skipper. That's my job.
What did you feel your responsibility was?
Do everything I could to see that they were properly taken care of until we got out of there.
He, I think, alone pulled everybody through it. He was a giant, and we'd follow him anywhere.
Finally, after 11 months of captivity and negotiation, America's first famous set of hostages was ready to come home. Exhausted, eaten, starved, they walked one by one toward freedom, with their commander, Pete Booker, leading the way.
And once I got across that bridge, and here's this Army colonel over there, and give me a cup of coffee and a donut, boy, I knew we were out of that damn place. I remembered as a kid reading Edgar Allan Poe's Buried Alive thing, and I remember the description of what that guy, poor bastard, went through, and I thought, gee, this was just like getting out of a grave that nobody knew you were alive in.
Good morning.
But not long after he was released, the nightmare started again for Booker, this time because of his own Navy. It began an investigation into the ship's capture and recommended Booker be court-martialed. The Pentagon eventually declined to prosecute, but Booker's ordeal as a Pueblo prisoner became a life sentence.
You're sitting alone in a cell, and your mind is telling you this is going to get worse before it gets better. But I had the responsibility for that crew. They were my men and my responsibility.
It would be 1990 before Booker was finally given the vindication he sought for his men. He convinced the Navy to honor the Pueblo men with prisoner of war medals.
Why was that so important to all of you?
The crew needed somebody to tell them officially in Washington that they'd done a good job.
The men of the Pueblo could finally put 1968 to rest. The nation had learned that Hollywood courage was not the only kind, that ordinary men facing ambiguous choices could also be brave. And so the sailors who survived terror and torture cheered each other and then cheered loudest for Pete Booker. Booker's crew is celebrating their 30th anniversary of freedom this month. Ask any one of them and they'll tell you they owe Booker their lives and all the things many of us too often take for granted. Children, grandchildren, the chance to hold a 4th of July family reunion. 30 years ago, Booker made possible one more thing for his crew. He got them home alive, just in time for the final amazing event of 1968.
We have liftoff. Liftoff at 7:51 a.m.
In the very last week of December, Apollo 8 flew the most daring and dangerous space mission yet. This was the first manned flight to go around the moon, out of sight, out of contact. From across that vast distance, the astronauts sent a message of hope to the watching Pueblo survivors, welcoming them home. And then they read a simple message for the rest of the world that was watching too.
God created the heaven and the earth, and the earth was without form and void. And God said, let there be light. And there was light.
What a wonderful world.
The darkness of 1968 was receding at last. The courage of Apollo turned us toward light and the promise of a more merciful future.
And from the crew of Apollo 8, we close with good night, good luck, a Merry Christmas, and God bless all of you on the good earth.
What a wonderful